I want to start a new electronics policy that year as far as my sermons go. Although I want to have you keep your cell phones silent during worship, I do encourage you to check in on Facebook or Twitter when you're here at church. And make sure that you share with your friends that you are here. And if during the course of my sermon you find yourself asking yourself a question, I invite you to Facebook or text me, and I will take the best 2 or 3 questions that I receive, and I will post them on the church's Facebook page, and I will post my answers to those questions. So text away as far as I'm concerned. Now, I have great news for any college students who thought that going to college would mean reining in their video game playing in order to make time for study. There's good news on that front. If you are an addicted video gamer and are also looking for scholarships to college, you may score on both accounts. The University of Pikeville in Eastern Kentucky has announced that it will begin offering scholarships, much like athletic scholarships, to students who have mad skills for playing one of the most popular video games out there, League of Legends. This video game is a 5-on-5 war game in which the goal is to take the opposing army's base. In this game, you team up with 4 other people to go to battle against another team of 5. As you may guess, people around the world play this game 24 hours a day. Because the internet connects people from everywhere, you can put teams of players together from almost any country. There are, in fact, thousands of teams, and everybody interested knows who the best teams are in the world. And in fact, if you don't play, if you don't know how to play the game, but you still want to participate, you can create your own League of Legends fantasy team, much the way that people who play fantasy football do so by picking different players from different NFL teams. Well, the University of Pikeville wants to recruit the best players in the world to come and play League of Legends for their college team. And they're willing to offer scholarships. They're offering 20 of them, by the way, to get the best players to come to the University of Pikeville. This program is handled kind of like an athletic program. You know, you have to keep your grades up, and you have to keep a minimum GPA. You have to listen to the coach when he tells you what to do. The team is coached by a graduate of the university by the name of Eric Van Hoos. He will teach the players how to play League of Legends like a team, how to strategize against their opponents. And he will rotate players in and out of the game, much the way that every coach does. Players will have regularly scheduled practice times where they will come and play video games like any other team. They will spend time watching video of their upcoming opponents, trying to learn their weaknesses and trying to learn the coach's game plan. Now, when I read this, I was thinking of how the conversation might go with parents. Can you imagine how this is going to work now? Imagine having a son who spends an inordinate amount of time playing video games, as many young men are known to do. You can't get him off of the couch to do chores. You have to argue with him about doing homework. You want him to get his grades up, and you worry that he's never going to go to college because all he does is play video games. You can just picture him in his 30s, still in your basement, eating Doritos, playing video games with his friends who are much in the same life position. But now he says to you, Mom, Dad, don't worry. I'm going to college. I'm going to get a scholarship to play video games. Terrific. By the way, if any of you parents are in this boat, Robert Morris College here in Illinois also offers scholarships for potential students who play League of Legends. Now, I'm using this example to show how much freedom we have in our lives to do the things that we want. For most of human history, survival required us to work from dawn until dusk, sometimes even later, just to make sure that we have enough food to eat. For many of the people of the world, that kind of existence is still their existence today. But most of us have a level of freedom that until now has not existed unless you turned out to be royalty. And I want to raise the question, as our author does today, of how to use all of that freedom we have. What do we do with our bodies during the time that we are privileged to live here on earth? Does Christian faith only revolve around what we believe about God, or does it impact the things that we choose to do with our bodies? I hope to convince you this morning that what we do with our bodies, whether it's exercise or play video games or eat or any number of choices that we make, the things that we do can either say something good about God, or in some people's minds, convince them that God doesn't exist or that God is irrelevant. The passage we read this morning deals with those questions, and it helps us understand why God wants us to make certain choices about the things that we do. This passage that we read this morning is written by Paul. Paul, as some of you know, was a follower of Jesus who became convinced that God was calling him to bring Jesus' message to the entire world. The challenge for him is that Jesus' message and teachings were rooted in the Old Testament. The people that he was trying to reach knew nothing about what the Old Testament said God had done in the world prior to Jesus. Paul started churches in a number of towns, including the city of Corinth in Greece. Paul taught people that, yes, in the Old Testament, God commands people to follow certain laws in order to be godly. Those laws covered almost every aspect of life, including what you ate, what you did with your property, who you could marry, who you could have children with, and how you were supposed to keep your body holy and clean. He also taught them that in sending Jesus, God was doing something new, even though all that stuff's in the Old Testament. God no longer judged people simply based on whether or not they followed certain laws. In fact, he tells people in the churches that he starts that they are no longer subject to the laws of the Old Testament. He tells them that since they believe in Jesus, God's Spirit now lives within them and is their guide to doing what is right. Instead of following God's laws, they're now supposed to follow God's Spirit. But they don't do that in a vacuum. They do so as a part of a group of believers who all have God's Spirit within them. Now, that sounds entirely different from what people were used to. The Old Testament describes God as being present in the temple building in Jerusalem. And one wall of that temple still stands in Jerusalem. You can go see it. It's the Wailing Wall. In order for people to encounter God, they had to travel to the temple. And there they would meet God. Now, as Paul says, instead of people going to the temple, God comes and lives within them through God's Spirit. Now that sounds great, right? I mean, God lives within you. That's what we believe. People at church in Corinth, though, they didn't have to memorize a bunch of laws and obey a bunch of laws. They simply followed God's Spirit, and it led them to do what was right. The problem was that some of them took the whole "you aren't subject to God's laws" thing a little too far. Paul gives us two examples of how they did that. And those examples are very helpful for us in making decisions about what we're going to do with ourselves and our bodies during the time that God has given us. The first example is that some people didn't see a problem with participating in some of the pagan practices that they used to engage in, as long as they knew that they really weren't following those pagan gods. Sometimes when they were hanging out with their old friends, people they knew before they started going to church, their friends would offer them food, of course. The problem is that the food that their friends were offering them had been used in a pagan religious ritual. And since they didn't follow their old gods, these new Christians thought, hey, what does it matter? I'm not under God's laws. I can eat whatever I want. God doesn't care. It doesn't mean that I'm going back to my old way of life. It doesn't mean that I'm going back to my old religion. And Paul agrees with them to a point. God didn't really care what food they ate. They could eat whatever they want. But Paul says that when they eat food used in those rituals, they run the risk of being associated with all of the other pagan rituals. Someone who's new to the church and doesn't understand their new faith may say to them, hey, I thought you were a believer in Jesus. Isn't it hypocritical to claim to be a Christian and then turn around and do something which seems contrary to being a Christian? Paul says that even though there's nothing wrong with eating that food, there's something wrong with exercising your freedom in a way that damages the faith of somebody around you. Since we are connected by faith to people of faith who have the same spirit, when we cause somebody else to have a crisis of faith, it's not just their problem. It's our problem too. Sometimes people associate things we do with other things that we don't do, just because of who we are, or who we're with. I remember when I was a boy, my pastor told me about the bowling alley in town. He was in rural Minnesota, and the most happening place in town, the place that was considered to be the center of all sinful activity, was the town's bowling alley. These days we don't think of a bowling alley as that crazy of a place, but back then, if something bad was going to go down, it was going to go down at the bowling alley. And he told me about times when he or other people from church would go and they would sit in a parking lot across from the bowling alley and just check to see if anybody from the church pulled into the bowling alley and went in. Just to see who's going in and out of that sinful place. Now, in my mind, it seems hypocritical to look for hypocrites. That seems contradictory. But Paul reminds us that we have to be conscious of how we're being perceived. People have seen a lot of hypocrites in their lives. They've seen a lot of people who claim to be Christians and appear to be doing something that betrays what they claim to believe. Even the appearance of hypocrisy is hypocrisy in some people's minds. And Paul says we have to pay attention to that. The other issue Paul dealt with was really all of the places that Christians take Jesus. Wherever people in the church went, Paul believed that they were taking Jesus with them. Some of the people in the church in Corinth brought Jesus to some pretty immoral situations. And Paul asked them flat out, do you realize that you're not just bringing yourself into that situation, you're also bringing Jesus into that situation too? I want you to think for a minute, through the past week that you've had, think of all of the things that you did, the errands you ran, the conversations you had, the texts that you sent to people, the things that you did when nobody was looking. And ask yourself, what would it have been like to have Jesus standing next to you as you said or did all of those things? Did you connect yourself with things that Jesus might not have approved of? Did you do things with other people that Jesus might not have wanted you to do? Paul reminds us that Jesus isn't just standing next to us. He's inside of us. So we drag him into all the situations that we get into. Wherever we are, there he is. If we really took that seriously, how would that change the way that we behave? How would it change some of the choices we make? How out of place are we when we bring Jesus into some of the things that we do? Paul uses the imagery of our bodies as God's own temple. We talk about words that we don't say in church, where the truth is that we are the church. We are the temple. God is living within us. As I mentioned before, when I was a pastor in upstate New York during the late 1990s, I went on 3 mission trips to one of our American Baptist projects in the Dominican Republic. I remember as I was getting ready to go on the first one, we had a meeting for everybody who was interested in going. Most of the people who went on this first trip were pastors from the American Baptist churches in New York State. They went over what we needed in order to be ready for the trip, the shots we had to get, the passports we needed to get, the visas, the things we needed to pack in our luggage. They went over the codes of conduct that we had to follow when we were on this mission trip. We couldn't leave the group, couldn't go off and do our own thing. We had to participate in all of the group activities. They coached us extensively about how to act when we were with our Dominican brothers and sisters. One of the rules that we had to follow regarded our clothes. We were going to the Caribbean, where it's kind of hot, and we were doing construction work on a Baptist school. They told us that we were not allowed to wear shorts. We had to wear pants or jeans at the work site. Many of us thought, well, that's a little strange. I mean, who cares whether or not we wear shorts? We're going to be there helping them with something that they need. Shouldn't we be free to wear whatever we want? Whatever's comfortable? We also had to wear dress shirts and ties when we went to the church on Sunday morning for worship. Women had to wear dresses. Now why would we have to do that? Didn't the Dominican Baptists accept people no matter how they dressed when they came to church? Why should we cater to them? We're doing them a favor. The project manager explained to us that culturally, the Dominican Christians have a very difficult time distinguishing themselves from the culture around them. And one of the ways that they've been able to do that is by dressing differently. I'm going to show you a picture here. It's a picture of us working on. Look at all these people. This is in July in the hot Dominican sun. And everybody's got pants on. Can you imagine how hot that's going to be? The fact is that they wear pants when they could be wearing shorts is one of the ways that the Dominican Baptists have been able to set themselves apart. The fact that they dress up on Sunday instead of just going casual is also an expression of how much reverence they have for God. Now, you may agree or disagree with them, but that's where they're at. The truth is, we couldn't have come down there and dressed however we wanted. But imagine the place that would put their pastors in. They would have to explain why they have chosen to dress the way that they have as an expression of their faith, and why the American missionaries, who were supposed to be setting an example, don't have to dress that way. And we could have done that. We really could have. But it would have caused a crisis of faith for some of the folks down there. And there was no need to cause a crisis just so that we could be free to dress however we wanted. Can you see how that situation translates to some of the choices that we make in our lives each week? Jesus' death frees us from legalism. It frees us from being robots whose existence simply revolves around obeying certain rules or feeling guilty for not following them. But with that freedom, the freedom to follow God's Spirit, comes great responsibility. God's Spirit lives within us. We take that Spirit to all of the places that we go, good, bad, and everything in between. People out there are watching. They want to know if we're for real, or if we're just like all of those other people that they know who say one thing and act another. Paul's challenge to the church in Corinth still echoes for us today. He's challenging us to do something a little bit more meaningful than sitting on a couch and keeping ourselves entertained while the days of our lives pass by. He's challenging us to glorify God with our bodies. Let us pray.